Welcome to Lecture DS-1, the first of our digestive lectures. We're going to start this with a quick overview of the topology and functions of the digestive system. Then we'll get into some sort of the four main functions with a little more detail. We'll talk about secretion, motility, digestion, and absorption. We'll then have a section where we go over the general anatomy and talk a little bit about what goes on at different places in the tract. Maybe a little side excursion into the idea of gastric bypass surgery. And then finally, we'll talk some about the different motility patterns we see in the digestive tract. Alrighty, let's talk about the digestive system. So, as we talked about the cardiovascular system, we talked about how the blood circulates around the body, and that there are certain areas where we have to interface with the outside world to bring materials in or out. We talked about the lungs, where we have gas exchange. Gases from the outside come into the blood, and gases from the blood go to the outside world. We talked about the urinary system, where we take mostly metabolic wastes and extra water from the blood and move it to the outside world. So now we need to talk about the last of those interface systems, which is the digestive system, where we're going to be bringing materials from the outside world into the blood. Now, that brings up an interesting way of looking at this. So let's talk about the idea of topology. So topology, okay, let's see which of my markers will work today. Topology is the mathematics of shapes. Now, if we think about the digestive tract topologically, I'm going to make the contention that you are, in fact, a donut. So consider this. If you imagine that to go into the body means that you have to cross at least one cell membrane, then if I travel in through my mouth, down my esophagus, through my whole digestive tract, and out the anus at the other end, I haven't crossed any cell membranes, which means that entire time I have been outside the body. In other words, your digestive tract is a hole that goes from one end of you to the other. Your body is a meat donut arranged around that hole, more or less. So, topologically speaking, you are, again, to some degree, a solid mass with one hole that goes through it. That's your digestive tract. Now, true, we have a couple of other holes. You'd have to talk about your the holes of your nostrils connecting to your nasal cavity, which connects your oral cavity. So you're now a donut with like a little side hole from that hole. But effectively, you are a one-hole thing, like a donut. If you imagine a donut, that's a mass of dough with one hole that goes through it. So if you took your body, and you can imagine that you were made of silly putty, so you could be reshaped and squished around, you could sort of squish your legs up into your body, and your arms up into your body, and your head down into your body, and then put your head up like this, and then you've got this hole that goes down through and just kind of reshape everything into a donut. So, you are a donut. And coincidentally, you are a donut which can digest other donuts. So, if you think about it, it's sort of a donut recursion thing. And let's not go too far that way. So, topologically speaking, you are a meat donut with a bunch of flesh and organs wrapped around this central tube. And in order to... The digestive tract's job is to take materials and put them in one end of the donut, kind of process them, and then along the way through the donut hole, absorb them into the donut. So that the stuff comes out the other end of the donut is just the stuff we couldn't use, plus some bacteria that live in there. Now that's a slightly disgusting way of looking at this, but it is kind of a useful way in that it reminds you that the digestive tract is technically outside the body. That as you pass through it, until you are food that has been absorbed, you have never actually crossed into the body itself. Which means that, like your skin out here on the outside, the digestive tract is potentially a route for infection. In fact, it's a very vulnerable route. Your skin is well made to defend against infection. It's waterproof. It has lots of layers of stuff that bacteria and viruses can't easily get through. Our skin isn't especially tough, but, it's okay. It holds up all right. So it is a good defense, but the whole point of the digestive tract is that it is not a good defense, that it's a way to get things into the body. But we don't want bacteria and viruses doing that. So along the digestive tract, we're going to have defense mechanisms to protect us against those microorganisms that are going to be trying to get in through this way. But we'll get to that. let's talk about kind of the four main functions of the digestive tract. So if we think about what is necessary to take materials from the outside, process them into a form that can be absorbed, and then absorb it, we can think of this as kind of having four different main components. So these are the main functions of the digestive tract. We can talk about secretion, which is moving things from the body into the tract. So moving materials from the body into what we'll call the lumen of the tract. The lumen, remember, meaning the inside of a tube. So this would be things like water, acids, enzymes, all of that stuff. The mucus, water, dilute solutions of enzymes, electrolytes, all of those things, we move those things into the digestive tract. We'll talk about that more in a little bit here. The second function might be motility. We have to move things down the donut hole. So the gastrointestinal tract has a lot of smooth muscle around it, which has interesting patterns of contraction to help move things along in controlled ways. A third one is digestion. I should go back and say motility is smooth muscle contractions to control movements of material. The third main function is digestion. Digestion is to break the food materials down into absorbable forms. And then, finally, absorption. To move materials from the lumen into the body. That includes most of the stuff that we secreted in. We put in water, electrolytes, and stuff, and then we need to bring that back into the body, mostly. It also involves the food materials that we've eaten. So when I eat something useful, and I've broken it up, digested it, then I have to actually get those molecules from the lumen of my tract into my body so that I can use them. So let's talk before we move on to other stuff about each of these with a little more detail. So with secretion, we mentioned how that's moving materials into the lumen of the digestive tract. Now, that ends up being something like 7 liters per day. In the course of a day, if you're eating a typical amount, you move something like 7 liters of fluid into your digestive tract. That comes in the form of mucus, which we have in various places along the tract to lubricate the tract, to moisten the food, and to protect our digestive tract from stuff in the food. Saliva, which contains, we're going to talk about that more in the next lecture, but contains water, mucus, and some other stuff. So, mucus, saliva, dilute, enzyme, and electrolyte solutions. So that would include things like the stomach acid that our stomach secretes. That's actually not as dilute. The bicarbonate solution from our pancreas, enzymes dissolved in water secreted mostly by our pancreas, but also by other things along the way. The electrolytes that we put in various places. All of this stuff, most of this movement of water with these things comes because we actively transport various dissolved materials like sodium into the lumen And then after we've actively transported those in, water is pulled along by osmosis. Remember, we can't actively move water, but we can move solutes, and water follows osmotically. So with all of that, you end up putting in a lot of liquid, something like 7 liters a day. Now, you can't afford to lose 7 liters of fluid a day very easily, so a lot of the later part of the digestive tract, much of the intestines, both small and large, is about reabsorbing that material, taking that water and electrolytes and materials that we put in and bringing it back into the body. Kind of like the kidneys, if you remember, that a lot of it's about reabsorption. So most of that secretion has to be counteracted. That said, 2 things to consider. One, you don't get all of it back. You lose typically something like half a liter of fluid a day through digestion. Just in the feces, you lose a little bit of water in that. This is also part of the issue that why something like diarrhea is so dangerous. So diarrhea involves skipping a lot of the reabsorption part in your large intestine and losing that water instead, which is why in the condition of diarrhea you lose a lot of watery feces through the anus. But that means you're not reabsorbing that water and a lot of those electrolytes, which is why it can be so dangerous. You can lose a lot of fluid every day with uncontrolled diarrhea. And if you don't have access to rehydrating solutions, ways to get those fluids and electrolytes back into your body, it can be fatal. So that's one of the reasons why when you look at rehydration solutions, things that you might give somebody who is suffering from severe diarrhea, they're not just water. Remember, you're losing a lot of salt, too, in that. And if you then take in just a bunch of water, you've replaced the water in your body, but if you haven't replaced the electrolytes, then what you've done is diluted all the salt solutions in your body, and you know why that's a problem. If I dilute the sodium and potassium concentrations outside of my cells, I have an osmotic problem where water tends to go into the cells. I also have an electrical problem since I've disrupted ENA and EK. So, this secretion, when we move that stuff in, is necessary, but we also have to keep in mind that we're going to have to reabsorb all of it, or take in enough water and salts to make up for any losses in order to stay healthy. So, that's the first set of things we're going to talk about. Then, let's talk a little bit about the idea of motility. We're going to talk a little more later this lecture about motility, but kind of a summary on that one would be that motility is patterns of contraction in digestive smooth muscle. The digestive tract is kind of long, I think a couple dozen feet overall maybe, and it's narrow, so in order to get food to go from one end to the other, you have to squeeze it along. But even along the way, sometimes you don't want to just squeeze it the whole way. Sometimes you want it to stop and mix around for a bit and then move on again. And we want things to move around at different times in controlled ways. So these patterns are not just as simple as squeeze everything down the tube. They require coordination. They even require sensing. That what kind of motility you want to do can often depend on what's in there. Even something as spectacular as, say, vomiting, when what you want is to move the stuff backwards up the tract and back out. That's actually not motility in the usual sense. That's more of pressure from the abdominal muscles pushing and the rest of the tract just opening up and allowing stuff to move. But we need that motility to be a little more complicated than just a simple squeezing motion. We need it to be responsive to what's in the tract and what's not in the tract. We need it to hold things in certain places for a while. How long? Well, it probably depends on what's in there and what state it's in. Sometimes we want to move stuff from here to here, but only very slowly because we're having to process it. So there's a lot of... It gets more complicated than you might think, which means it has to be coordinated. These processes, these patterns, are coordinated by something called the enteric nervous system. Enteric, that word generally means having to do with the digestive tract. The enteric nervous system is this mesh of neurons, mostly organized in 2 layers. in the wall of the digestive tract. So this is 2 layers of neurons that form sort of a mesh along the way. Those 2 layers are the submucosal plexus and the myenteric plexus. And between the 2 of them, they coordinate all of this. So through the enteric nervous system, this includes, by the way, sensory neurons, which bring information about the digestive tract into the plexuses, plexi. Motor, neurons which then control the muscle of the digestive tract. And interneurons, which are a part of the network where we bring in information from the sensory neurons and then process it and then coordinate what goes on after that. Which altogether starts to sound a little bit like the rest of the nervous system. We talked about how the brain and spinal cord take information from sensory neurons in the peripheral nervous system, process it, make decisions about what to do, and then send out commands to the body. Well, this is doing the same thing. Which is why some people have called the enteric nervous system the gut brain. Now, that sounds scarier than it is. You don't actually have a brain around your gut. This isn't organized anything at all like your central nervous system. But the comparison is not completely invalid either. It has the ability to sense information, coordinate and integrate responses, including some kinds of reflexes, and send those commands out to the digestive tract. We also communicate from one area of the tract to the other. For example, the duodenum communicates with the stomach to control how quickly the stomach empties its contents into the small intestine, and that's partially done through the enteric nervous system. Another interesting thing is, while this is heavily controlled by the autonomic nervous system, so the ANS influences this. That's not just pointing at submucosal plexus, that's this whole thing. The ANS influences all of the enteric nervous system. So my sympathetic and parasympathetic responses can adjust this function. We know that the enteric nervous system can work without that influence. In animal studies, if they cut off the enteric nervous system from the autonomic, the enteric nervous system continues to work. So it's semi-independent, so that the digestive coordination doesn't actually require the rest of your nervous system to oversee it. Which is kind of interesting in a way. As people have studied this, we think this is more important than we thought. That the functioning of that enteric nervous system does a lot of important and interesting things. So, anyway, so that's part of the idea of motility. Mostly that's involved in controlling the motility of the tract. All right, let's go on to that third major function. The idea of digestion. If you remember, we said digestion is taking food molecules and breaking them into stuff that's small enough to be absorbed. That's going to include 2 aspects. There's the mechanical digestion, which is just taking big chunks of food and breaking them into small chunks of food. So large pieces of food get broken into smaller pieces. But here, we're talking about things that don't involve actually changing the molecules at all. So we're not making or breaking chemical bonds. So here, I mean things like chewing. So if I eat a pecan, for example, I've got a big chunk of nut, and then I can chew it and chop it and break it and grind it into little tiny pieces of nut. And anything where we're taking a larger chunk of food and squishing it, grinding it, and breaking it into many smaller pieces, that would fall under mechanical digestion. And the question, of course, is why. And part of it is that you need it to be in pieces small enough to easily move through the digestive tract. But more importantly, in a way, is this. If you imagine a big chunk of food made of gazillions of molecules, in order to absorb that food, I'm going to need enzymes to break those molecules into smaller molecules. But in this big chunk, my enzymes can only work on the surface of the chunk. So here, my enzymes can only work on that surface layer, meaning all the stuff in here is going to have to wait to be digested until the enzymes work their way in. And that can take a long time. That may take too long. But if I take this large chunk and break it into many small chunks by physical, mechanical digestion, notice now my enzymes have a lot more space to work. I'm not going to draw that in on all of them, but you can see that the enzymes now have a lot more places where they can work on these molecules. In other words, I've increased the surface area a lot. So this is really the main purpose of mechanical digestion, to take food and break it into lots and lots of tiny pieces so there's more places for digestive enzymes to work on the molecules, which is the second part of digestion. If the first part is mechanical, the second part is chemical digestion, which is mostly using enzymes to take larger food molecules and break them into molecules that can be absorbed, to break down large molecules. For example, proteins need to be broken up into their component amino acids. Polysaccharides need to be broken up into monosaccharides. You would talk about similar things for nucleic acids being broken down into nucleotides, triglycerides being broken into glycerol and fatty acids. All of that stuff that early on we talked about the biomolecules and how most of them are large molecules built from smaller ones, and we've talked about how we build some of them. Digestion's the other way around. I need to take that protein that was built with lots of amino acids and break it into amino acids so then I can bring those little pieces into the body. And then I'll build them myself into other stuff. So mechanical and chemical digestion both are going to occur in the digestive tract. Mechanical usually kind of earlier on, but some chemical also starts pretty early on in the process. So that's the third one. And then the final part of that process is absorption. We're actually going to spend a lot of time talking about that one at the end of the second lecture. But absorption is really just about, once I've broken these down into these small molecules, how do I get those molecules from the lumen into the body? So we'll talk about some of those transport mechanisms when we get there. Now, one other function that we didn't mention in those four, although we've alluded to it, is the idea that we have to defend ourselves against microorganisms, since the intestinal part of the tract especially is made to be vulnerable so that it's relatively easy to move things into the body. We want to make sure, if we can, that by the time I get to the intestines, any microorganisms that have come in, and they will, are destroyed or disabled. So I have to have defense mechanisms along the whole digestive tract, but especially early on, to try to intercept and destroy or disable any incoming microorganisms. We do that in a number of ways. There's a lot of immune cells, like your tonsils are actually immune tissue, meant to house immune cells to help monitor for incoming stuff. We also make the environment in the digestive tract very hostile. The stomach, for example, all of that concentrated acid in the stomach, part of its role is actually to prepare proteins for digestion and to activate some stomach enzymes. But another part is to be lethal to most bacteria. Many incoming microorganisms do not survive the acidic environment of the stomach. There are some that do, some things that have evolved for that specific purpose. We probably won't get to those, but some things can get through that acid. But most microorganisms are killed by the acidic environment of the stomach, so that's part of our defense. All right, good. Now, In the second part of this lecture, we're going to be going over the major anatomy of the digestive tract and talking a little bit about what each part does as we go. So, see you in a moment.